It's a pleasure to be speaking with Dr. Graham Orpwood, who is the recipient of the 2022 Lifetime Contribution Award from the E-Assessment Association. Graham, welcome. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I thought it would be useful for you to give us a précis of your career, because you've taught on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think it would be useful for everyone to hear a bit more about that.
Sure. I began as a chemistry teacher here in England many years ago now, and moved fairly soon to Canada, where I was also a chemistry teacher at a college level, and that led to graduate studies and interests in research, and a career which then included research, teaching, teacher training, policy making, and what was so rich was the way that I was able to combine all of those. It meant that I was never in one institution for very long, but it meant that I got a taste of all kinds of aspects of education.
I'd like to hear a lot about the work you did with the Ontario college system in Canada, how that started, what the issue was to begin with, and you tell me about that work, because it's fascinating, actually.
Well, it is an interesting story. The Ontario colleges, there are 20 colleges in Ontario enrolling about 100,000 students a year. And of those 100,000, roughly 50,000 take maths in first year, in some form or other. They may not be specialists in math, but they need math for nursing, math for business, math for accounting, math for all manner of vocational programs. What was concerning the Ontario college system was that as many as a third of those students were either failing their maths in first year or not doing sufficiently well to be able to go on with confidence into their chosen program. This was resulting in people dropping out of college, which had financial consequences for the colleges, which is why the administrations were worried. The faculty were worried because, they were losing students, and the students were worried because they didn't seem like they had anywhere to go. So the question is, what can we do about it? We have a problem here of students failing math. It was a question of increasing success and retention. And the traditional answer to that was, let's create a test and make sure that only those students who are past our test will get into the college. Until they realized that might just reduce the total number coming in. It might increase the percentage who stayed in, but it might reduce the number coming in the first place. That wasn't really what we wanted to do. So what we started thinking about is, how can we make the students who do come to college more successful? And that's really the challenge that faced the Ontario college system. And they said to me, could you create a test that will somehow help them to be more successful? So I said, well, what you're talking about then is a fundamentally different sort of test. Not a test which is designed to have winners and losers, and the losers we say bye-bye, but rather a test where potential losers are made into winners. And we call that formative assessment. And that's a very different sort of thing. And so that's where we started working with a company called Vreta, based in Toronto, on a construction of a test that was going to enable us to identify where students had weaknesses and where our formative training could be used to help them to do better. So we did a lot of research on what it was that students were getting falling over in first year at college. And we discovered, much to our surprise, that it was not what they had failed to learn in grade 11 or grade 12, prior to coming to college. But the math that they had failed to master in grades 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 in primary school, that was the cause of the problems. Fractions, decimals, percentages, ratios, you know, the real basics of maths. If you haven't got your head around those things, then everything else becomes more complicated and difficult. And what we decided to do was to create a test that would, in a modular fashion, identify whether students had got those topics adequately or failed to get them. And so we created this test, we created the support modules, and it's been successfully used ever since.
Would you be able to go into a little bit more detail about the solution that you all developed for Canada?
Yes, well, we designed a test that was modular in structure, that was made up of, I think it was 8 topics, which our research had shown that are the topics most often that students have trouble with when they first get to college. And for each module, we created a mini test of about 8 items, sufficient to be reasonably able to make a decision as to whether students had mastered that topic or not. And we made a very high pass mark, if you like, for each module. These were very simple mathematical problems. This is not grade 12 math. This is grade 4, grade 5. So what we said is the content is going to be very simple, but we want you to do very well at it. And so we made 80% the cut score on each of the modules. If you got 80% or better, we say you've obviously mastered this topic. But if you got less than 80%, then you needed to do some extra work in that area, and we would switch you to the support module, where they would reteach the content. So basically back to what is a fraction, and really the most fundamental idea. Very, very simple math, grade 4, 5, 6 math, but taught to adults. And so we don't ask people to take primary school textbook material. We give them resources at their level, but with very, very straightforward content. And we found that when the students took this, different students, some didn't need any remedial work at all. Others needed to remediate on all 8 topics. Most often, there were 4 or 5 topics that were frequently. Fractions is the traditional one that everybody gets, not everybody, but most people have a bit of trouble with. So we found that this was something which students could do at various possible stages. Certainly when they arrived at college, some of them would take the test after the college had admitted them. This was not an admissions test. Their admission to the college program did not depend on it. But as soon as they got admitted to the program, they were able to take this test. And then from there on, they were on their own.
Are you aware of the sort of impact that it's had, and maybe not, so we don't have to cover this, but are you aware of any impact that this has had now for Ontario college system?
Well, just to say that I haven't got data on the student results, but I do know that of the 22 colleges, I think 80% of them are using the test or a version of the test in their systems. It operates in French and English because we have French colleges as well as English colleges, and they're exactly equivalent tests. And the French modules the support modules are also available. And so the colleges have voluntarily taken it on, but they were very much involved in the beginning. From the very beginning, it was the deans of technology that asked for this program to be developed. And so when it was developed, they were invested in it. It was their program. We were based at one college, Seneca College, but we were working at every stage with the faculty and students at colleges.
I think what happened in Canada was fascinating because the problem came from the Ontario college system, something that they recognized. And so this was a solution that they wanted you to develop. But interestingly, it was about empowering the learner.
Absolutely.
Rather than necessarily setting a hurdle, if you will, that would potentially make their lives easier as institutions, enabling them to see, which students they should accept into the institution. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and their approach and
well,
your
I'm quite
view.
passionate about this because as far as I'm concerned, assessment should be all about learners. Assessment should be part of teaching and learning, not something removed from it. Too often I hear assessment being done to students rather than for students. Many students will find it that they can relate to that. They feel that A-levels and GCSEs are done to them, not because it's going to help them in any particular way, but that's something which I think assessment is in danger of going wrong. I think assessment must be united with teaching and learning more fundamentally, rather than making it, as you say, a hoop to jump through or a barrier to further opportunities. And so I think that we have to start with, we're in this business because of learners. There would be no schools if we didn't have the desire that people learn. We have an obligation to use every means we can to help them learn. And assessment is one of the most effective tools. If I can tell you, when I used to teach teachers about assessment, I would say to them, think of the director of a choir. Who's been in a choir? Well, a lot of people have been in a choir. Or what about the coach on a football team? People maybe can relate to the football team. That coach is standing on the sidelines, assessing all the time every player on the team and the team as a whole, and screaming out instructions and advice for how to do what they're doing better. And if they follow his advice, they're all winners. That's assessment, in my view, where the teacher and the system is all focused on making everybody better. And yet, too often, assessment is more like going to court, where you've been caught caught speeding, let's say, and you're there to find out the penalty. That, if you ask many students whether they see assessment more like going to the magistrate or the coach of the football team, I think you can guess which many students would find is the one that they relate to.
Let's look at research and the role that you think that plays in product development, in your own work as well, the benefit of it, the barriers that you've faced as well.
Well, I think research is difficult, but difficult for a lot of different reasons. And I have come to the view that the most difficult and the most important aspect of research is asking the right questions. Too often we ask the wrong questions, and then the research doesn't have much value. In the case of this college math project, for example, we started off examining the grade 11 and 12 marks that students came to college with on their transcripts. And we did incredible numbers of analysis. Every single student who took maths in Ontario colleges for about 8 years in a row, we related every single student's achievement in maths at college back to their grade 11 and 12 marks in high school. We found no correlation at all. We found that the students who did well in high school did well in college. Students who didn't do well in high school didn't do well in college. But nothing that really helped us. Until one day we suddenly started looking at the content of the courses designed to help students at college that have been developed by faculty in response to student needs. And we found that the content of those courses had nothing to do with college math. It had to do with topics which the faculty knew were problems. The same old topics I mentioned before, fractions, decimals, percentages, ratios, and so on. And we said to ourselves, maybe those are the topics we need to start asking about. And so we started doing research on students' understanding of those topics. And that's what led to the structure and content of the tests that we created. It was because we'd taken away the focus from grade 11 and 12. Notice that every university and college in every country I know bases their admissions on students' achievement in grade 11 and 12. But suppose that's a very poor indicator of likely success at university or college. It's looking at the wrong thing. Maybe we should be looking at students' really basic knowledge and skills. So that's something which I found really was the turning point in our whole program. And it had to do with asking the right questions.
Why don't we pause now and look, in your view, sort of how assessment has evolved in your career, how it's valued, how it's done?
In some ways, I get quite discouraged when I look at how it's evolved, because education itself has broadened and become richer enormously. There's more and more that we have expectations that education can do for our children and for society. And yet the tools we use for assessment, particularly the high stakes assessment, are rigidly maintained in much the same way that they were 50 years ago when I first started teaching. When I started teaching, they had the General Certificate of Education, GCE O-level, and then A-level. And now we've got GCSE and A-level. And what do they look like? Well, they're mostly written examinations. So over 50 years, we haven't changed very much when it comes to the assessments that people count as most important. I get quite discouraged when I hear people talk as though written examinations were the real assessment, and assessment conducted by teachers as being a poor substitute. In fact, given that we have had a history of written examinations, suddenly when COVID comes along and we ask teachers to substitute for that, we don't give them any training, of course, but we ask them to substitute for the written examinations. Everybody complains with the results that are obtained. And when we, after COVID, return to written examinations, people say, the real thing again. Is it the real thing? Or is it merely a focus on the things which written examinations can assess? I used to give workshops to Chinese teachers in China, and they have a real commitment to written examinations. Historically, it's said that they invented assessments of this sort. And I used to say to them, imagine your son or daughter were learning to swim. So you take them into the swimming pool and you do all the things that you do, and then you want to assess whether they can swim or not. Do you sit them down and say, now I want you to write a little essay on swimming, or answer the following questions on swimming. No, of course you don't. You throw them in this pool and say swim. And that's the point. The numbers of things that written examinations can assess are strictly limited. And what's the point of expanding the goals of education if you don't correspondingly come up with new and exciting methods of assessment? Now, fortunately, I think e-assessment can make a big difference. Not the total difference. You can't assess everything with e-assessment either. But e-assessment enables a much richer array of assessment techniques to be used than written examinations do. So that's a step in the right direction. And we discovered this when we were starting to develop the Ontario College math test. We found that we could ask questions in a lot of different ways and find out what students know better. But I think we still have to think, what is it that we want education to deliver? And how do we achieve that? For example, I did chemistry at university. And back in those days, there was a practical examination in chemistry where I was given actual chemical problems to solve, but the chemicals and resources and the equipment to do it. And I actually spent 6 hours in a laboratory working on the solution to those problems, because they wanted to assess not just whether I had memorized a lot of chemical information, but whether I had actually learned to do chemistry. Now that was quite enlightened for the 1960s, but I don't see that that has been built on and grown. In fact, if anything, in the last 2 or 3 years in this country, we've seen a reduction of the additional sorts of assessments that teachers could organize in their schools. And the less use of that in GCSE, for example.
Tell me a little bit about all the international projects that you've been involved in, the international assessment projects.
Sure. The first major project that I was invited to participate in was the third International Math and Science Study, which was a program of the International Educational Assessment Association. And they involved some 45 countries in a test of math and science at various age groups. And I was invited to be the science coordinator to help construct the tests for science in that program. This was back in the 1990s. And I spent 5 years working with this program. And at the end of it, I had really mixed feelings. First of all, I learned an enormous amount about assessment as a result of participating, because there were a lot of experts there from whom I learned a lot. So that was a positive aspect. The other positive aspect was that I had an opportunity to interact with assessment specialists from many, many countries. And I was actually able to visit probably a dozen countries during the course of that program. And so I learned from them about the sort of assessments that they were using in their own countries. However, at the end of the day, governments had spent millions of pounds on this assessment program. Both the international funding of the project and also each country had to spend a lot of money of its own on that. And at the end of the day, I said, name me one teacher or one student who has benefited as a result of all of this money being spent. And I've really found that bothered me. The fact that this got massive media coverage, politicians cited it in Parliament all the time, and voted more and more money to be spent on these international horse race type studies. And yet no student and no teacher actually were able to do anything better as a result. And that made me wonder just how important and valuable these things really were. And after my 5 years there, I went to the other end of the scale and worked with a school district in Ontario who had got a new primary school science program. And they came to me and said, we've been asking our teachers what help they needed in terms of professional development and so on, what help they needed to make this new curriculum in science work, be implemented in their school district. And they all said they needed help with assessment. And so I started working with initially one school district, and then later that grew to about 17 school districts because others decided they wanted to get involved as well, on a program of professional development for teachers on how to do assessment with grade 1s and 2s and 3s. And then we developed, with those teachers, we developed resources which was made available freely to all teachers in those school districts via the web. And we constructed performance assessments, as they're called, challenges for students to achieve to demonstrate their knowledge of the science content. And it was fascinating to see what came up. I mean, for example, the grade 1 curriculum had a unit on the senses: hearing, seeing, smelling, and so forth, touching. And this is really grade 1 stuff. And the assessment project, which I thought was brilliant, it didn't come from me, but the assessment project that was associated with that was to invent a game for children who are blind. Now, if you think about it, most games that we play involve seeing. Whether they're board games, whether they're ball games, whatever game you can think of, just about every game requires that you can see something. So if you're designing a game, you're thinking about how do I use all the different senses other than sight to play a game. Now that to me demonstrates your understanding of the science that was being taught in that unit. It's at grade 1 level. You don't have to write a complicated piece of prose. You just have to make this game up. And that's the sort of assessment we came up with. And we came up with, for every grade level up to grade 8, there were 5 strands of science content. So for each of those 40 modules, we generated a series of practical problems and challenges for teachers to use. And as far as I know, they're still being used. And that's 20 years ago.
Graham, I'd like to ask you to reflect a bit on the work you've done here in the UK, in particular with NASBT, the National Association of School-Based Teacher Training, because I think it's an evolution, really, of what you did in Ontario with the Ontario college system. Would you be able to tell me a bit about that?
Sure. The teacher training in this country has evolved from when I learned to be a teacher, strictly at the university. And now more than half of all new teachers are trained on the job in the schools by school-based teacher trainers. And I think that's a huge step forward. Their national association wanted help to be provided to them for teachers who were having problems with maths. The government had previously had a national test, a literacy and numeracy test for new teachers. And for a variety of reasons, they had decided to give that test up, which was a popular move. But they then placed the responsibility onto the school-based teacher trainers for assuring themselves that new teachers were in fact numerate and literate. So they said, well, that's fine, but how do we do that? And so we started a discussion with the association of adapting the Ontario College Math Test to the content that the government had outlined primary and secondary school teachers should be able to master in order to consider them as numerate. And we developed a version of the Ontario College Math Test which was focused on the new content. But otherwise the system was the same. And so school-based teacher trainers could use this with their teacher candidates in any way they chose to do. They are obviously autonomous in terms of the way they do their teacher training. We just developed the resource, and it was paid for in different ways, either by the teacher candidates themselves in some cases, or by the school-based teacher training organization in other cases. But that's, as far as I know, still being used and is, I think, quite a useful model.
It is. It's one that actually I think you see that the students are benefiting from it in being able to demonstrate their functional skills in numeracy. They're able to give potential employers confidence in their numeracy skills. And I think some of the teacher training institutions are also using it as remediation. So for candidates, when they originally start the program, they're able to use that to supplement any skills that they didn't originally get.
And that's important because in our previous research in Ontario, I have no evidence about this to be the case in this country, but I have no reason to suspect it's not also true. In our original research, we found that one of the problems that science and math had was that it was taught in primary schools largely by teachers who were not themselves experts, specialists in math and science. They were strong teachers. They had good background in language and social studies often, but not a strong degree of confidence when it came to maths and science. And that lack of confidence amongst primary school teachers often transferred to their students. And the students would go home and say, oh, I can't do maths. And the parents would say, well, I couldn't do maths either. And maths got this reputation of being a hard, difficult subject which only a few people can do. And I don't happen to believe that only a few people can do math. I believe anybody can do math, but it just needs to be taught in the right way. And so teachers need to have some confidence in their own math skills. And so we believe that this has got a very important indirect impact on the children.
I'd like to ask you about the eAA as a former board member, as a judge for the award, entrant of the award, and winner this year of the Lifetime Contribution Award, as well as an individual member. What is, for you, the value of the eAA? Why did you join in the first place? And what does the association mean to you?
Well, I think we just learn incredible amounts from each other. And I think an association like this, its first task is to bring people together and enable that sort of transfer of skills and information which can make us all more effective in our assessment. In the relatively short number of years that I've been a member of the eAA, I've learned incredible amounts from such an incredibly diverse community that it makes up the eAA. And I think the association as a whole is evolving very rapidly, it seems. I mean, already it's changed significantly from when I joined about 5 years ago. And I think the evolution that it's undergoing is exciting.
In terms of how is it evolving from your point of
Well,
view?
I mean, first of all, the conference. I mean, a conference, it inherited a conference that was already a going concern, but it is now a part of the association's mandate to bring people together and to share information and skills. And I think that it was just really unfortunate that the very moment that it took over this responsibility, COVID struck and we were all prevented from meeting each other. But I think the growth in the most recent conference and the fact that we've got more people participating shows that people were ready for that, and that direction is going really well. I think the awards are very important. Having been a judge on the awards, I can testify to the incredible diversity and interest. I mean, the limitation of awards is there's only one award for each category, whereas many of us could have been happily giving 3 or 4 awards in the categories we were asked to look at. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on all over the place, and I think the awards program enables everybody to share in that.
Any advice for the current board or executive team of the eAA?
Just to keep on going. And I think that the fact that they are open to suggestions from all comers is great. It's one of the, I mean, many organizations that I belong to are so political, if you like, that you can't in fact make suggestions. You certainly can't affect change. That is not the case with the eAA, and that's a real strength.
I'm going to ask you about what you think are the challenges facing the e-assessment industry.
Yes, I think that not just the e-assessment industry, but also the whole assessment community has got to somehow not be led by the nose by the media and the politicians into thinking that what they regard as high status assessment is the best or only way to do it. Now, I'm quite sure that individual members of the eAA don't buy that, but I think we've got a role to play in influencing public opinion that I think we could do more strongly. I think that ministers need to be challenged when they come up with, frankly, wrong-headed ideas about educational assessment. As far as e-assessment is concerned, I think this is going to grow and evolve of its own. I think technology is becoming more exciting all the time, and I think the one thing I think I'd like to see more of is empowering individual teachers, because I still come back to the belief that the assessment that a teacher does in the classroom is the most effective. Teachers didn't think that they did assessment unless they were giving out a test. I said, you mean you don't wander along and watch the kids as they're doing their work, and you lean over and say, don't you mean that to be different? And so on. That's assessment. That's assessment, and it's the assessment that child is going to learn from that day. The test will be long since forgotten. But the assessment that every teacher does is critical. It's also formative, by the way. But I think we as a e-assessment community should be doing more to support individual teachers at the primary school level and secondary school level.
I think you're right. I'm really curious. Do you have any ideas about how that might work?
Oh, I think yes. I think you could set up a project and probably get funding for it from an external resources source, some corporate funding perhaps, and then pull together teachers from around the country who are interested in assessment and have been working on assessment, and actually devise a program to support teachers. I mean, you can put resources on a website. You can organize a system of workshops. There are lots of things that can be done to help teachers, but I think that if the association took on the mandate of being a resource to help teachers do better assessment using technology, that would be a major contribution.
Bring me up to date about the work that you've been doing more recently in the last, since you left Canada and been working with VRETA. Tell me some of the projects you've been working on.
Well, I retired from the university some years ago, and soon after that was still doing the research for the college math program. And out of that came the Ontario College Math Test, which we've discussed, and VRETA asked me to come and work with them to help them as a sort of assessment consultant, if you like, as they were developing e-solutions to math assessment problems in other jurisdictions. And they developed a primary math program in Luxembourg, for example. They've been working with the French Ministry of Education to develop math assessment instruments for them. And they also developed, at the Ontario government's request, a math test for teachers, for a bit like the one that has been given up in England. And we created the Ontario Math Teacher Test. I forget what its exact title was, which lasted for 2 or 3 years, was quite effective, but was not popular with the union, the teachers' unions in Ontario, and so that in turn has been suspended for the time being. But in the meantime, that was my interesting work, and while I was working with VRETA, we moved to live in England, and so they asked me to explore the potential for using some of the VRETA methods and systems here, and that's how the NASBIT project began, and another project at the University of Derby that I worked on for several years, which has now been renewed for a further 3 years. The president of the University of Derby has signed an agreement with VRETA to continue doing that and making it available to all students coming into the university. When
Do you think e-assessment works best? How? What are the conditions? For you, what's a shining example of e-assessment working well?
Well, I think the VRETA program, Elevate My Maths, is probably the one which I've seen that I've been involved with that works well. But if you sit and read through the awards that eAA has given over the last several years, you realize that the scope of e-assessment is just vast. The number of applications with innovative individuals have applied e-assessment to their particular problems, and that they've come up with a rich array of innovations. And so I don't think we've even seen the beginning of it yet. I think it's going to evolve over time. It would be nice if we felt that governments were awake to recognizing that as well, because I think we've got to somehow move on from this fixation of the written examination that we still seem to live with.
Is e-assessment about empowering the learner, empowering the teacher, empowering the institution?
All of the above. As I look back at where I started my career as a chemistry teacher in Sussex in the 1960s, for me, assessment then was all about measuring what people know. And for many people, I think it hasn't evolved a great deal from that. Except that I think more enlightened thinkers have pointed out that what matters is not what you know, but what can you do with what you know. Now, if the only thing that matters is writing it down on a piece of paper, then that's what assessments is going to do. But maybe there's more to that life than writing down what you know on a piece of paper. Maybe, for example, you can apply it to something practical. That's a much tougher assignment. Maybe you can use it to analyze a problem or situation. Maybe there are all sorts of goals of education that your knowledge can be used in relation to. And I think assessment has got to look very carefully at the second dimension, I call it, of assessment. The first dimension is what do you know? The second dimension is what can you do with what you know? And that's something which opens the door to all kinds of assessment. And I think that if you only stick with the written examinations, that sticks with the emphasis on what do you know. But if you ask most employers why people are hired, they'll say because of their examination results. But if you then ask them why are they let go or fired, it's nothing to do with examinations, nothing to do with what they know. They're not good team players. They don't have the personal discipline to contribute to the company. So maybe what really matters to employers is not just what you know, but how you can use that in the mandate that company has. And I think that this is something which educators have got to give much more thought to.
Graham, I just want to say it's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much for your time. I know everyone at the e-assessment associations had will really benefit from your knowledge and your expertise. Thank you very much, Graham.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure, and I value the time I spent on the eAA board, but also as a member I look forward to continuing in the future.